Day 19 of the Lindsay Clancy trial almost ended in a mistrial, but it didn't. And before religion entered the courtroom for the second time in this trial, the jury got to hear from two prosecution witnesses who, although agree that Lindsay Clancy was mentally ill, they don't necessarily agree on her diagnosis. And I feel like one of the prosecution witnesses actually gave the defense more than the Commonwealth intended. Let's begin. The morning began with Dr. Mack, who returned by Zoom to finish his cross-examination with Kevin Reddington. Mack testified Friday that Lindsay suffered from major depressive disorder, retained the ability to understand that her actions were wrong, and could conform her conduct to the law. Reddington began by establishing that this is approximately the third time Mack has testified in court specifically about criminal responsibility. He also questioned Mack about several previous cases in which courts reportedly criticized his qualifications or methodology. Mack either did not remember those cases or disagreed with Reddington's characterization of the rulings. And from there, the cross-examination became increasingly tense. Reddington questioned Mack about being retained through Park Dietz and Associates, how much money he earns from forensic evaluations, and whether being hired by the prosecution could create confirmation bias. Mack denied approaching the evaluation with a predetermined conclusion, but throughout the morning, he struggled to answer some very direct questions. He appeared reluctant to say where he stayed while he was in Massachusetts, eventually acknowledging that he stayed in a private home in Belmont. He also seemed uncertain about how to pronounce Dr. Kirk Hilbrun's last name, despite interviewing Lindsay alongside him and referring to him casually as Kirk. At several points, Mack answered a different question than the one Reddington asked or attempted to explain the premise before giving an answer. Reddington became visibly frustrated, and eventually, so did Judge Sullivan. The judge repeatedly reminded Mack that his role was to answer the question being asked. If he could not answer it as framed, he could say that, and the Commonwealth would have an opportunity to clarify his testimony on redirect. Now, one important concession involved Lindsay's psychological testing. Mack acknowledged that the MMPI administered by Hilbrun was valid, and yes, I looked it up. MMPI stands for Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory. It's a standardized psychological questionnaire used to measure personality patterns, mental health symptoms, and whether someone's answers appear reliable. In Lindsay's case, the results showed a tendency to minimize or underreport unusual experiences rather than exaggerate or fake symptoms. Reddington then walked Mack through the symptoms documented before January 24th, including severe insomnia, anxiety, panic, loss of pleasure, emotional detachment, hopelessness, suicidal thoughts, intrusive thoughts, and episodes of dissociation. Mack agreed that many of those symptoms were present, but characterized them as symptoms of depression rather than postpartum psychosis. He continued to rely heavily on the DSM's narrow postpartum onset specifier, while Reddington challenged him with other standards, training programs, and postpartum screening tools. By the end of Mack's testimony, his conclusion remained the same. Lindsay suffered from a mental disease, specifically major depressive disorder, but retained criminal responsibility. His delivery, however, was difficult. Both Reddington and Judge Sullivan appeared frustrated by how hard it was to get direct answers from him. The Commonwealth's next witness was Dr. Kirk Hilbrun, a forensic psychologist and professor at Drexel University. His demeanor was completely different. He was calm, soft-spoken, engaging, and much easier to follow. He has testified as an expert more than 300 times and said approximately 75% of that work has been for the defense. He estimated spending about 180 hours on this case. That included reviewing thousands of pages of records, interviewing Patrick and Susan Clancy, and spending approximately 10.5 hours evaluating Lindsay over 3 days in April. He and Mack participated in 2 of those interviews together, but reached different diagnoses. And this is important. Hilbrun diagnosed Lindsay with bipolar II disorder. He found it difficult to identify a clear hypomanic episode in her history. Again, for those who may not know, hypomania is a noticeable period of elevated or irritable mood and increased energy or activity that is less severe than full mania. Hilbrun ultimately said that his bipolar II diagnosis was supported by Lindsay's diagnosis and response to treatment at Tewksbury Hospital. So now we have another expert, this time called by the Commonwealth, diagnosing bipolar II. However, Hilbrun rejected postpartum psychosis and acute psychosis as the explanation for what happened on January 24th. But his bipolar II diagnosis does strengthen the defense's argument that the providers treating Lindsay in 2022 and early 2023 may have missed an underlying bipolar disorder while prescribing antidepressants. And just as a reminder, that matters because SSRIs are antidepressants. When bipolar disorder is missed, antidepressant treatment, particularly without an appropriate mood stabilizer, can trigger a manic episode or rapid cycling between mood episodes. Hilbrun also discussed the psychological testing he administered. He said Lindsay showed a slight tendency to underreport unusual experiences rather than exaggerate them. He described her as bright and sophisticated in the way she responded. He then stated most of her current clinical scales were not significantly elevated. I had to look that up. That simply means categories of test scores that measure different groups of psychological symptoms. An elevated score flags an area that deserves closer attention. The one scale that remained elevated involved suicide and death. Hilbrun also emphasized that Lindsay has remained on one-to-one suicide precautions at Tewksbury for more than 3 years, which is the hospital's highest level of supervision. In Hilbrun's opinion, that showed that her suicide attempt was, quote, highly lethal and very serious, and that she continues to present a suicide risk. Then the Commonwealth moved into what Hilbrun believed happened on January 24th. He considered 2 possible explanations. The first was acute psychosis involving a command hallucination. The second was that Lindsay intended to die by suicide and killed the children because she believed they would suffer without her. At one point, Hilbrun appeared ready to move past the slide discussing the evidence that supported acute psychosis. The prosecutor directed him back to it, and that testimony gave the defense something useful, in my opinion. Hilbrun acknowledged that Lindsay reported hearing a male voice commanding her to kill the children and herself. He also acknowledged evidence of thought broadcasting, meaning she feared other people could hear or know her thoughts. Ultimately, he found the second explanation more persuasive. He found it highly unusual that the voice allegedly appeared for the first and only time during the approximately 18 minutes surrounding the killings and then disappeared. He also pointed to differences in how Lindsay later described the words spoken by the voice. In one account, the voice said this was her last chance and she had to kill the children before killing herself. Other accounts included the ideas that the children would suffer without her or that she had to take them with her. Hilbrun also found it significant that she did not report trying to resist or drown out the voice through prayer, music, or another distraction. His opinion was that these experiences were intrusive thoughts that had been developing for months rather than a sudden command hallucination. He also focused on Lindsay's memory. According to Hilbrun, after she regained consciousness, Lindsay initially said she could not remember what happened and had to be informed. He explained that human memory can be funny and reconstructive. If that initial memory loss was genuine, he questioned how she could later remember something as specific as the exact command hallucination with confidence. He also recounted about Patrick asking, "What did you do?" and Lindsay answering, "I tried to kill myself." Now that perked up my ears a little bit because I recently re-listened to Patrick's testimony. Patrick testified that he asked Lindsay, "What happened?" He did not say, "What did you do?" I'm just putting a pin in that because Hilbrun used the wording of that exchange as part of the basis for his opinion. Hilbrun believed that a person acting under a command hallucination might have responded with something like, "I did what the voice told me," rather than immediately describing the suicide attempt. Ultimately, Hilbrun characterized this as an altruistic filicide. Altruistic filicide is when a parent kills a child under the belief that death will protect the child or spare them from suffering. He said Lindsay was suffering, desperate, and convinced that her children would suffer without her. In his opinion, she killed them as part of her plan to die, driven by a belief that death would spare them from suffering without her. He therefore believed she remained criminally responsible. While explaining his reasoning, Hilbrun referenced Lindsay saying, "Go to God, baby," her Catholic upbringing, heaven, and the concept of suicide as a mortal sin, and everything stops. There was an immediate sidebar and the jury was removed. Reddington moved for a mistrial, arguing that religion and mortal sin had now been improperly injected into this trial for the second time. Judge Sullivan denied the motion at this time, but ruled that Hilbrun's understanding of Catholic teaching was irrelevant and completely inappropriate. He brought the jury back, forcefully instructed them to disregard that portion of the testimony, and then sent them home for the day. I already posted a separate video with my full take on how close this came to derailing the trial, so feel free to check that out. And that was the end of day 19. Hilbrun will return to complete his testimony, and then we are expecting to see one more rebuttal witness before closing arguments begin. I do believe they anticipate to start closing arguments on Wednesday, barring any more delays. As always, like, comment, share, subscribe, do all of the things so I can continue to bring you these updates, and I'll catch you in the next one.